What if the bands that defined rebellion, the musicians who screamed about fighting the system, actually ended up inside it? Prison is not a metaphor in rock and metal. For some of the genre's most recognizable names, it was a destination: the courtroom, the cell, the sentence. Some of them walked back out and rebuilt everything. Others never recovered. A few are still behind bars right now. The crimes ranged from a single terrible night to patterns of behavior that eventually produced consequences nobody could avoid. These are 15 heavy metal stars who ended up exactly where their enemies always said they belonged. 15. Vince Neil, Motley Crue. Vince Neil was the golden-haired frontman of Motley Crue at the peak of the band's commercial dominance, and on December 8, 1984, he made a decision that ended one life and permanently altered the arc of his own. He left a party with Hanoi Rocks drummer Razzle, got behind the wheel of his car, and crashed into an oncoming vehicle. Razzle was killed. 2 people in the other car were seriously injured. Neil was charged with vehicular manslaughter, and the legal process that followed produced one of the most discussed sentencing outcomes in rock history. He was sentenced to 30 days in jail and 5 years probation. He served 19 days before being released. The families of the victims were left with a financial settlement. But for most people who followed the case, the 19 days bore no reasonable relationship to the human cost of what had happened that night. A wealthy rock star had killed a man while driving under the influence and been back at work. 14. Tommy Lee, Motley Crue. Tommy Lee co-founded Motley Crue and spent the band's most commercially dominant period as one of the most recognizable drummers in the genre, known as much for his personal life and public behavior as for the music. The band's entire identity was built around the mythology of excess and wildness, and Tommy Lee lived that mythology more completely and more publicly than almost anyone else connected to the Crue's orbit. In 1998, that mythology collided with a legal consequence that the band's image could not simply absorb and reframe as entertainment. He was convicted of felony spousal battery after assaulting his then-wife, Pamela Anderson, and sentenced to 6 months in jail, of which he served approximately half. The conviction and the sentence placed him in a county correctional facility and generated the kind of tabloid coverage that the Crue's public relations machinery had always been able to manage but could not redirect toward a positive narrative this time. The victim was one of the most recognized women in the world, and the details of the case were extensively covered across every media outlet that touched celebrity news in 1998. His prison experience generated its own public documentation almost immediately. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his story occupies the position of the most tabloid-saturated incarceration in the genre's history, a case that played out in real time, in front of an audience that had been following his personal life for years before the arrest arrived. The excess that the band had always presented as a feature of their identity had produced a consequence that existed in a completely different register from anything the mythology had prepared people to process. 13. Ronnie Radke, Falling in Reverse. Ronnie Radke was the original vocalist of Escape the Fate, before his involvement in a street fight in 2006 that resulted in the death of another person. He was not directly responsible for the fatal blow, but his presence and involvement in the circumstances that produced it were sufficient to result in a battery conviction and a probation violation that sent him to prison. He served nearly 3 years in the Nevada prison system before being released in 2010 and immediately beginning the work of rebuilding a career that his incarceration had interrupted before it had fully started. The band he formed after his release, Falling in Reverse, gave him a commercial platform that Escape the Fate had never quite provided, and the career he built around his prison experience and his deliberately confrontational public persona generated both a significant fan base and a consistent stream of controversy that he appeared to embrace as a branding decision rather than try to manage or reduce. He documented the prison experience in his music with a directness that made clear the incarceration was both something he had survived and something he had found ways to use. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his story is the most explicitly converted into commercial output. A musician who emerged from nearly 3 years behind bars and built the defining chapter of his career, partly on the energy and the imagery that the imprisonment had generated. Whether the conversion of that experience into product represents artistic authenticity or calculated persona management is a debate the rock community has been having since Falling in Reverse became commercially significant, and Rodkey has never shown any interest in resolving it for the people arguing about it. 12. Randy Blythe, Lamb of God. Randy Blythe was arrested at Prague Airport in June of 2012 as he arrived in the Czech Republic for a Lamb of God performance. The arrest related to an incident from a 2010 concert in which a fan named Daniel Nosek had been pushed from the stage during the band's set and subsequently died from the injuries sustained in the fall. Czech authorities had been building a case for 2 years, and Blythe was the target of it. He was held in Pankrak prison in Prague for 37 days, while the legal proceedings moved forward around him. The conditions in Pankrak were genuinely difficult, and Blythe was transparent about what those weeks had involved in the memoir he subsequently published about the experience. The prison housed serious offenders, and the conditions bore no resemblance to anything connected to the commercial world he had come from. He described the experience with a candor that made clear that the 37 days had been among the most challenging of his life, and that the uncertainty about the outcome, which carried potential for a sentence of up to 10 years, had been a sustained psychological pressure throughout. He was ultimately acquitted at trial in 2013 after the court determined that his actions had not been reckless in the legal sense required for conviction. The verdict was a relief, but not an erasure of what the case had cost the Nosek family or what the incarceration had cost Blythe personally. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his case is the one where the outcome was the most genuinely uncertain during the period of imprisonment, making it the entry where the stakes were highest and where the acquittal felt least guaranteed to anyone watching from the outside. 11. Tim Lambesis, As I Lay Dying. Tim Lambesis built As I Lay Dying into one of the most respected metalcore bands of the 2000s, fronting an act known in the Christian metal community for music that explicitly engaged with themes of faith, hope, and personal redemption. He was arrested in May of 2013 after attempting to hire someone to murder his estranged wife. The someone was an undercover police officer. He had met with the officer at a gym and handed over money and a photograph of his wife, along with information about her daily routine. The arrest ended the band's commercial career instantly and comprehensively. He pleaded guilty in 2014 and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The combination of the crime itself and the gap between what the music had claimed to stand for and what the man had actually done created a specific kind of betrayal that the Christian metal community processed in a way that was distinct from how more secular metal audiences might have responded. He had sung about faith, and he had tried to have his wife killed. The two realities existing in the same person required a kind of reconciliation that many former fans decided was simply not available to them. He was released on parole in December 2016, after serving approximately 2 years of his sentence, and immediately began the work of rebuilding As I Lay Dying, with a new lineup that attracted enough of the original fan base to sustain continued recording and touring. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his story represents the most complete collapse of the gap between a musician's stated values and their documented actions, a case where the music's explicit moral framework made the crime not just legally serious, but personally and spiritually catastrophic for everyone who had believed in what the band said it was about. Before moving ahead, take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next story. 10. Gahl, Gorgoroth. Gahl served as the vocalist of the Norwegian black metal band Gorgoroth during the period when the band was among the most extreme and genuinely frightening acts operating in the genre. His stage presence was built on real intimidation rather than theatrical performance, and the band's live shows generated police attention in multiple countries for content that challenged the limits of what authorities considered acceptable public performance. He was one of the most discussed figures in the black metal scene during the early 2000s, specifically because the persona he projected appeared to carry genuine rather than performed danger. In 2006, he was convicted of assault and sentenced to 14 months in prison following an incident in which a man was held at his home for several hours and subjected to what authorities described as ritualistic mistreatment. The conviction confirmed what many people who followed the scene had suspected, that the line between the darkness Gahl performed and the darkness he was capable of outside the performance context was less clearly drawn than most audiences prefer to believe about the musicians they follow. He served his sentence and continued making music after his release, most notably through the project Gahl's Weird and other collaborations that maintained his presence in the extreme metal world. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his entry reflects the specific character of the black metal scene's most serious legal troubles, cases where the ideology and imagery the music promoted found expression in real-world behavior that produced legal consequences and left victims in circumstances that the music's defenders were never adequately able to address. 9. Varg Vikernes, Burzum. Varg Vikernes created some of the most influential atmospheric music in the history of black metal under the Burzum Project name, and was simultaneously one of the central figures in the Norwegian church arson campaign that destroyed historic wooden buildings across the country in the early 1990s. He was convicted of multiple church burnings carried out as ideological statements against Christianity. The destruction was deliberate. The targets were chosen specifically for their historical significance, and the damage to structures that had stood for centuries was in some cases permanent and irreversible. Then, on the night of August 10, 1993, he went to the Oslo apartment of Øystein Aarseth, the Mayhem guitarist known as Euronymous, and Aarseth was stabbed 23 times. Vikernes was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum penalty available under Norwegian law. He served 15 years before being released on parole in 2009. The years he spent behind bars produced written material, recorded ambient music, and the development of political and ideological positions that remained as troubling outside the prison as the crimes that had put him inside it. His release did not produce any retreat from the positions that had surrounded his imprisonment. He moved to France, continued writing and creating under the Burzum name, and maintained an online presence that generated repeated controversy connected to the same ideological ground his prison years had occupied. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his case represents the most comprehensive portrait of a musician whose crimes were real and severe, and whose subsequent behavior demonstrated that the incarceration had not produced the kind of change in direction that prison sentences are sometimes presented as creating. 8. Bobby Beausoleil, Love/Manson Family. Bobby Beausoleil was a guitarist who played with the Los Angeles psychedelic rock band Love in the 1960s and whose musical talent attracted the attention of Kenneth Anger, the avant-garde filmmaker who used him in a project and introduced him to the underground music and art scene that connected directly to Charles Manson's circle. He became one of Manson's earliest and most committed followers, and in August of 1969, he murdered a man named Gary Hinman at Manson's direction, an act that preceded the Tate LaBianca murders that followed, and that was intended to cover an earlier dispute. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, a sentence that was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment when California briefly abolished the death penalty in 1972. He has appeared before the California Parole Board more than 20 times across the following decades and been denied release on each occasion. During his incarceration, he has composed and recorded music, including a score for the Anger film he had originally been involved with, and has maintained a presence in the arts community from within the prison system that represents one of the more unusual ongoing creative careers in the history of musicians behind bars. As of 2026, Bobby Beausoleil remains incarcerated at a California correctional facility in his mid-70s. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his story carries the weight of the longest ongoing imprisonment on this list, a musician who was present at one of the most discussed moments in the history of American crime and who has spent more than 5 decades in the California prison system as a consequence of choices made in the summer of 1969 that have never stopped defining everything that followed. 7. Jan Nordtveit, Dissection. Jan Nordtveit founded the Swedish black metal band Dissection and created recordings that are still regarded as among the finest and most musically sophisticated in the history of the genre. The Storm of the Light's Bane from 1995 is considered a black metal masterpiece by most serious listeners in the scene, and his ability to combine genuine technical musicianship with the atmospheric darkness the genre demanded at its most extreme placed him in a category distinct from many of his contemporaries. In 1997, he was convicted of being an accessory to the murder of a man in Sweden and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The murder had been committed by an associate, and Nordtveit's role was judged to be serious enough to warrant a conviction that took him out of the music world for the better part of a decade. He served approximately 7 years before being released in 2004 and immediately reconvened Dissection, completing the album Rein Chaos in 2006 and presenting it publicly before ending his own life with a gunshot in his Stockholm apartment surrounded by candles. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his story is the only one where the prison sentence was followed immediately by a return to music and then by a deliberate and documented conclusion to the musician's own life. He had described the final album as a completion of what the band was always meant to achieve, and his death as a philosophical act consistent with his stated beliefs. Whatever one makes of that framing, the trajectory from prison to creative return to chosen ending is among the more striking sequences the genre's criminal history has produced. 6. Roy Estrada, Mothers of Invention. Roy Estrada was the bassist and vocalist who contributed to some of the most important and challenging recordings in the history of rock music as a founding member of Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention. His presence on the group's early albums placed him at the center of one of rock's most ambitious creative enterprises, and his subsequent work with Little Feat added another chapter to a career that the music world had regarded as significant and creative. Nothing in that first chapter of his life suggested the second chapter that was coming. He was convicted in California in 2004 of a lewd act committed against a child and served a prison term before being released. He relocated to Texas following his release, where relatives provided him with access to children, unaware that he was a registered sex offender. He was subsequently charged with the repeated molestation of a child under the age of 14. And in 2012, a Texas judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole. He was 68 years old when sentenced and will be in his 90s if he reaches the end of the term. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, his story represents the most complete departure from any musical legacy across the entire list. The distance between his contribution to the early albums of the Mothers of Invention and the specific crimes for which he is serving 25 years without parole is not a distance that can be bridged by any framing of artistic significance or historical contribution. He is currently in a Texas correctional facility, and the music he made with Zappa belongs to a person that the human being serving that sentence has left entirely behind. 4. Brent Hinds, Mastodon. Brent Hinds, the guitarist of progressive metal band Mastodon, was involved in a physical altercation outside the MTV Video Music Awards in Las Vegas in September of 2008 that left him with severe injuries to his head. The incident involved another musician and became one of the more discussed incidents of backstage violence connected to a major award show, generating news coverage that put Mastodon's name into contexts far removed from the musical conversation their records had been building across the preceding years. He was not incarcerated as a result of that specific incident, but his legal history across the years surrounding Mastodon's commercial breakthrough included multiple arrests connected to alcohol-related incidents and public altercations that placed him in legal jeopardy on more than one occasion. The pattern of behavior that surrounded his most turbulent period created a public profile that made the band difficult to present commercially in ways that did not reference the ongoing personal crisis their guitarist appeared to be managing. His story within this list is one of the closest calls, rather than a confirmed extended sentence, a musician whose behavior across a specific period of his career generated the kind of legal exposure that in different circumstances and with slightly different outcomes could have produced a very different biographical chapter. He continued with Mastodon, and the band's commercial and critical trajectory continued upward, which means the window of maximum danger passed without producing the worst available outcome, which is not the same as saying it was never genuinely close. 3. G. Allen. G. Allen was a punk and shock rock performer who built an entire career around the deliberate elimination of the boundary between performance and genuine personal violence, and who spent significant periods of his adult life incarcerated for crimes that bore a direct relationship to the behavior he presented on stage as art. He was convicted of criminal sexual conduct in Michigan in 1991 and served approximately 1 year in prison for assaulting a woman. The conviction was consistent with a pattern of behavior across his performing life that had generated multiple arrests in multiple states across many years of concerts that frequently ended with Allen in a police vehicle rather than a dressing room. The relationship between what he performed and what he was willing to do outside performance was never clearly separated in his behavior, and the Michigan conviction represented the legal system's most successful attempt to assign formal consequences to a pattern of conduct that had been generating complaints and arrests for years before that specific case reached the conclusion it did. He was released in 1993 and died from a heroin overdose 3 months later at the age of 36, before any of the subsequent planned legal confrontations had time to materialize. Among the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail, G. Allen's entry is the one where the relationship between the music and the crime is most direct and most deliberate. Every other entry on this list involves a musician whose criminal behavior existed in some relationship of separation from their artistic identity, even if the separation was thin. His entry is the one where the elimination of that separation was the explicit artistic premise, which makes the legal consequences that followed not just predictable, but in a specific sense, the logical endpoint of the entire project he had spent his career building. 2. Emperor's Bard. Bard Eythun, the drummer of the influential Norwegian black metal band Emperor, was convicted of the murder of a gay man in Lillehammer, Norway in 1992 and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was 18 years old at the time of the killing, which was carried out with exceptional brutality, and which he later described in interviews as motivated by homophobia and the cultural atmosphere of violence that had developed around the Norwegian black metal scene during that period. Emperor had been building a reputation as one of the most technically gifted and artistically ambitious bands in the genre during the same years that the crimes surrounding the scene were accumulating. Eithun's arrest and conviction removed him from the band at a critical point in their development and placed one of their founding members inside the Norwegian prison system for what ended up being a decade of incarceration before his release in the early 2000s. His story within the 15 heavy metal stars currently rotting in jail represents the most direct connection between the ideological environment of the Norwegian black metal scene and a specific violent act committed by one of its participants. He has spoken with considerable candor in interviews conducted since his release about what the scene was, what it encouraged, and what he did. The candor does not change what happened, but it provides one of the more complete accounts of what the intersection of music, ideology, and violence looked like from the inside during one of the genre's most genuinely dangerous periods.